Welcome to the Smart QA Musings, which, as you all know, is a gentle flurry of interesting thoughts. And today, as we commence the new year, I thought it would be interesting to look at the professional identity that each of us have and how it's possibly drifting due to various forces, market expectations, businesses, technology, and so on. And muse about some interesting things as 9 possible musings on the slow drift of professional identity. Now, professional identity itself, it doesn't change overnight. Our identity doesn't happen in an instant. In a way, it shifts gently. It's in a way is shaped by various tools which are evolving, the way we contribute, which is becoming more quieter, which we will talk about, and maybe embracing capabilities that and actions that we do that are beyond the typical familiar labels of what we do. So which means what was once very clear kind of becomes vague. It begins to soften. And that's a strange experience because growth often occurs before it's recognized. You're already becoming something new. You have noticed, but you have no words for it, and so on. So there is an interesting shift that all of us go through, and that's what I thought would be interesting to muse. So what was clear about a value? Where I might say, look, I am the person who focused on maybe issues or bugs or test suites or automation and stuff, which is what we all kind of started off with in some sense to demonstrate the identity of our work. But now we're probably more like, we are questioning, we are thinking, we are trying to prevent waste, we are trying to shift left, we are trying to exploit tools, and all we're trying to do is to kind of, showcase work that can be seen. And that's a bit of a discomfort, isn't it? So, in a way, the QA is going to be shifting from the move from a visible execution to a very subtle influence. No more is it about just the bug counts, the test suite and stuff. The contributions are different, right? And the contribution is more like, hey, we had an interesting discussion, and in the process of discussing with you, I might have prevented something really fatal. So maybe my 15-minute discussion is what I did probably meaningfully this entire week, for example. It's not about demonstrating that I found 100 issues or did something interesting. And what do I say? How do I say that? Right? And that's where it slowly changes in terms of how we look at things. It's insight replacing activity. So the insights that I have because of meaningful intellectual exploration, physical experimentation, exploit using technologies, I gain a lot of insights and therefore I'm able to prevent, I'm able to add value. It's not anymore about the artifacts that are a representation of me in terms of cases or scripts or defects or plans or whatever. Not just that. It's probably my judgment. So the judgment kind of replaces artifacts. And more often it's not just the answers that I'm giving every day, right? It's more often more like the questions that I ask. And that's where it changes. So the insight is replacing an activity, a judgment is replacing an artifact. The questions carry more weight than the answers per se, and it's a shift. And how do we handle with it? How are we comfortable with it? And that's the whole idea. So I thought I'd look at it from 9 different aspects or dimensions or parts of this drift. I'm quite sure there'll be many more that you can probably think of. 9 ways this kind of transformation shows up in your work. And by the way, there is a philosophical bent to it because each of these are related to the notion of identity. And identity is a very deep philosophical contest. So I thought it would be interesting to kind of, briefly connect, if you will, not make it very harsh or very deep, to connect to certain Western and Eastern, so to speak, philosophical ideas. And therefore connect each of these musings in that. So let's start with a very fundamental challenge, so to speak. And that challenge is when your work that you do hasn't got a real name. Now, what do we mean by that? So let me title this as the language gap. Like I mentioned a minute ago, where we said if somebody asked me this question, what did you do this week? So maybe I would say, you know what, we had a stand-up, somebody asked and I had a performance review, whatever, and then you say, hey, I did A, B, C, D, E, etc. So I analyzed, I put out a plan, I wrote some stuff, I experimented with some tools, whatever activity. But then let's say, it was probably an interesting conversation that I had with the fellow folks. And then I found something fairly interesting, which, let's say, prevented a lot of waste. But it had no ticket. It had no document. It had no metric. So when somebody asks me this question, what do you do? Do I say, I had a 15-minute interesting conversation that produces month of waste or 3 months of waste? Because I can't say that. The struggle is, how do I display my notion of value here? How do you name this in a way that it feels real? Because I can't say I fixed 100 tickets, or I wrote this elaborate document, or I have this wonderful metric. And that's when it in a way, the language fails us, isn't it? The work exceeds in the meaning that I could explain using the language that I choose. An interesting way to think about it, don't you? And if you look at it from a philosophical sense, you might find many things. One, when you look at it from the Eastern side of philosophy, or Upanishads, for example, or the Tao philosophy, so to speak, you will find this in Upanishads, neti as a word, not this, not that. It won't say what it is. It will only say not this and not that as a mechanism to display, mechanism to understand the truth, so to speak. So it is always set in terms of negatives. It's not set in terms of positives. When you look at it from a Tao angle, what happens is Tao says what that can be spoken is not eternal. So it values silence, it values the unexplainable. In a way, it is kind of connecting to what we were talking about, right? That the whole idea being that there is a lot more subtlety in what we do, and that subtle is important, and that cannot be explained using a language. And that's what some of the philosophical aspects actually talk about, that you can't really make it very comprehensible or explainable because it's beyond the realm of standard reasoning. I thought it was comfortable for me to take recourse when I'm able to ask to explain about work where it exceeds its meaning. Now, there was also a Western philosopher who also talked about fact in a very different sense. So, and what he said was, the Western philosopher Wittgenstein, I think he's German, he said that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. And therefore he said, the perceived limits of my world are, in a way, constrained by the language that I use. So, the point that I was trying to make as one of the issues that I have with respect to identity is maybe I'm doing far more interesting work which I can't easily explain. That's a problem, right? That's a challenge for me. Now, if I go on to the next musing, which is one of the 9 musings that I have on this particular topic, let me title it as the recognition asymmetry. Kind of building on what we just talked about, right? That what I do most valuable is also the least visible. And that's what we alluded to very briefly, isn't it? That I can't express it and therefore it's invisible. So I do something interesting in a meeting room or discussion and stuff like that. It's a question that stops a bad idea before it gets built. It's helping see some risk before it happens. And that's where the trouble is, right? And somebody asks me, what did you ship? What can you point to? When somebody asks me, how do I in my performance review communicate that? Because the value that they created and the value that gets acknowledged are very different, because the value gets created in possibly a future which we also will see it as another musing. But the problem is there is a bit of a challenge of recognition, right? Where my best work happens in rooms where decisions get unmade. It may be in questions that stop bad ideas. in possibly helping see people risks before they become problems. And we all know in the current world that we are trying to be that. We are trying to be the sense maker. We are trying to sense things that can go wrong, that we are trying to explore in the future and prevent some of these. And so the value is, you don't see the failure, and therefore, you only see the fact that it doesn't happen. And that's the interesting asymmetry that we have, that we get into. If you look at it, from the philosophical bent of mind, there was this gentleman, Bishop Berkeley. He said, hey, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, does it make a sound? Interesting question, isn't it? Because you didn't hear it, because you were not there. And very similar to the idea of, if you prevent a problem that never materializes, you get the idea drift, right? So that's very similar to what it is. If you go to the eastern side of things, you will find it slightly differently. And on the eastern side of stuff, I think if you look at it from the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, where it talks about you are responsible only for your actions, not the outcomes. And that's the highest element of truth if all of us could emote it, which is called as Nishkama Karma, right? Which means you are action without attachment to the fruits of the outcome or the outcome. Well, that's the most elevated stance. So maybe this challenge, I take comfort in that idea that I'm just doing my work and doing very well. And there will be therefore this asymmetry that comes along. So I hope I'm not putting you, I hope I'm connecting with you in a slightly deeper sense and probably helping you reflect in a very different manner. Let's go on to the third one, the paradox of mentoring. All of us, obviously, we work with younger people. We onboard a new engineer who's smart, who's eager to learn, ask questions, and you're probably explaining something about the product, about design, about tooling, about foundations, and so on and so forth. Not necessarily everybody is young, right? But let's see the interesting thing. It kind of creates a strange grief, as if you were to coach or teach somebody. Why? Because you are exiting that, and you are getting somebody into that. And those skills that you are probably transferring, like a guru sishya, so to speak, are skills that no longer define your work, but you're teaching them to become what you're actively in the process of ceasing to be. The skills that they need, skills that you have, but skills that no longer define you. And that's an interesting shift. So you're teaching what you're kind of leaving behind, right? And you're trying to prepare them for something that you can't yet name because you yourself are trying to figure out. And that's where the interesting Greek philosopher Heraclitus long back said, as an interesting statement, he said, you cannot step into the same river twice. What he was trying to say is, the same river is not the river is not the same because it is flowing. So you step into it once, you can't claim I stepped into the same river because the river is moved. And that was the philosophical bent that when Heraclitus said, long back. Well, and if you go back into other Eastern stuff, the same idea of anicca in Buddhism, which says everything is in a state of flux. So there's no such thing as a permanency. Or if you look at it from, the Zen philosophy, which says ichigo, ichi-i. Ichi means one, right? The moment will never occur again. Ichi means one in Japanese. And that's the strange thing that, that happens, right? But that's what it is. So we are trying to teach to somebody for a skill which we are never going to be probably. And therefore it is in a way subtly telling you that there isn't anything fundamentally permanent, right? The role is constantly changing. And the authentic mentoring during transformation means teaching both the form and the dissolution of the form, showing someone the foundation while acknowledging that you are standing elsewhere. And that's really the mentoring paradox. It's about honesty. Can you teach someone what they need to know today while being honest that you really are moving forward? So let you pause for about 10 minutes to suck it up before we move into the next one. And what's the next one? The problem of my credentials. What do you mean by that? Well, let's say you're updating a LinkedIn profile. You're refreshing your resume. You're sitting in a conversation where somebody asks, what do you do? And so what do? You all realize all these are templates, right? There's a LinkedIn, there's a template. There's a CV, there's a template. Somebody asks you what you do, there is a kind of a templated answer. But these templated answers are probably a reflection of your old identity, the credentials, where the names cannot hold an identity. Like the profile, the resume, the job description. They're all designed for who you are. So I write automated tests, or I do this, or I have done that. Oh, it's technically correct, it is true, but it misses the actual value that you're creating. And that's the interesting friction of identity in transition. How do you describe yourself? How do you describe yourself of that identity in some of the forms that we communicate? Because the forms cannot hold what you're becoming. And these are all frictions that we go through, because we know we are probably doing a great thing, but we are not able to convey that. One there is no name, or one that is showing in the future, or one this, the form itself does not lend itself to do that exercise. Right? So the administrative apparatus of communication of this evolution is a problem, which in philosophy would be called as ontology, right, of what exists. So if you connect, this is probably what it is, the idea of the Maya. Maya is, what would be normally understood as illusion. But truly speaking, it is a superposition of various names that reflect a reality. Right? And that's probably one that we might have known, because Maya is a very interesting word. Maya, karma, and all that stuff, right? And that's really what it is here. So the professional identity is more often very disciplined by the structures that are supposed to recognize. The resume templates for one. Right? And therefore, the LinkedIn profile, your job title, your role description, these are just names projected into reality. And that's sometimes a challenge, because there's only so much you can actually talk about, so much that you can. So the credential problem itself isn't about updating on LinkedIn. It's about recognizing that the names are always going to lag behind the reality. You're not failing to describe yourself properly, but the categories themselves does not keep up with the evolution of work that you do. Right? And therefore the answer is not to try to force your evolution into such categories, but to be honest, to be saying, I am becoming something we really don't have quite a language for yet. Of course, it's a nice thing to talk about it here, but I'm sure it's, you have to really think on how you want to communicate it in a more, let's say, in a more professional setting where somebody's just looking to not look at it philosophically, but I leave you with the thought. So the credential problem is when the names cannot hold the reality of what you do, and that's a problem with the identity. Now, if I continue on this entire idea, what could come next? The idea of the dilemma of permission. Who authorizes you of your becoming? So if I did not get a fancier title, does it mean I did not become that? If somebody didn't tell me you're a senior manager or a director or whatever be it, am I not that? That's the question that we're trying to ask. The tension that all of us live. Your title hasn't changed, your job description may not be, kind of looks the same, maybe as with last year, but the work that you're doing is probably very fundamentally different. You are maybe influencing architectural decisions. You're probably shaping a product strategy. Maybe you're asking questions that change what gets built. You're operating at a level of judgment and synthesis, and they weren't really written down in your earlier job description. But you're doing fundamentally different work, right? And so, do you have to wait for someone to officially authorize this evolution? Give you a different name? Or do you have to, or is it, I just do it, right? I don't have to seek any permission. And that's the real notion of who authorizes your beginning, right? And Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist philosopher, there are many schools of philosophy on the existential philosophy story. He had a very famous phrase. He says, you're condemned to be free. A very interesting statement that he made. You're condemned to be free. That means there is nobody going to restrain you, right? And that's what he basically said. Kind of sounds dramatic, isn't it? You cannot escape the freedom to choose who you become, right? So that's why I guess when you're put into a prison cell, some people would say, you can constrain me within a cell, but you can't prevent me from, freely thinking and, imagining myself to be in somebody else, in some other different place. So even within the constant constraints that we have in the context of a corporate hierarchy, a role description, a job description, we still have the radical freedom of how we want. And that's the whole idea of how I can relate to this Sartre's, existential philosophy, so to speak. Right? And when you look at it from an Eastern side, there is this, Tao has this idea of Wu Wei, where it says, well, all of us can do effortless action, which is aligned with your nature, not constraint, no tension, no permission, right? And of course, if you take, the Bhagavad Gita, it would use two words, Swadharma and Paradharma, where it talks about your nature and the duty prescribed by others, and therefore it simply says, it's what the role says, but what the organism expects and what the box defines, that's the Paradharma, what is externally dictated. But the Dharma, the Swadharma, or your own innate nature is about doing what is authentic to what you are and what you're becoming. So understand that it is better to do your work imperfectly than to do someone else's work perfectly. And that's the tension that we all of us, or some of us, possibly face, right? The permission to align. Then nobody needs to give you permission, right? So there's no need to ask anybody. The question is, you just need to acknowledge. The organization might catch up with you eventually, or it may not. But waiting for permission to be who you are, that's a choice to stay stuck. But remember, we are condemned to be free. Interesting, isn't it? So, a few second pause. I know each one of them are fairly interesting, possibly. To me, at least, it was. And a little more deeper than what it is, because it's not, we're not discussing standard stuff here. So what would be the next in line that we could possibly look at it from a perspective of time? The temporal dissonance. What do we mean by that? We are doing tomorrow's work. Maybe we're influencing the decisions that people make in architecture. Maybe we are shaping what gets built. We are preventing some problem. All these are stuff in the future, like what we talked about earlier. But what am I being measured by? Maybe by some things like coverage, percentages, automation metrics, defect counts, and so on and so forth. Some standard metrics. Not necessarily these, maybe some more. And therefore somebody asks me, so where are we on this coverage, this sprint, for example? And here you are, thinking of, well, I spent the entire week doing some massive reviews on design. I asked so many questions that prevented categories of issues. I influenced on decisions. I probably saved months of technical debt. How do you translate it in the context of time now? Because we looked at this, we are looking at the various steps for different views or dimensions, right? Here we're looking from a time dimension. How do you translate the present day value into past tense metrics? And that's the problem that we have, living in multiple timelines at once. That's the temporal dissonance, right? And a German philosopher, again, he said this, right? He said, the human existence is always being toward future while being thrown from the past. But we all know that we all are supposed to be now, right? And the notion of now. So, as a QA professional, we are probably existentially stretched across, in a way, incompatible temporalities. That means time, measured by historical metrics. And that's what makes it very, very strange, right? And the philosophy of time here is the metaphysics of absence. A work is marked by what doesn't happen. You're creating value in a negative space. And that's the interesting thing. Right? So when you look at time, time can be done and measured different ways. You can talk about it from a chronological time. How many something did you do this week? Right? Or it could be seen from the context of, that's the kala. The other way it could be the samaya, it would be the moment, the timing, the opportune intervention, knowing when to ask. There could be another version of time called ritu, or cyclical time, seasonal time, understanding patterns, rhythms. So when you see time in the Eastern context, it looks at it in very different forms. The notion of chronological time, the ordering of time as in terms of past, present. The other one knowing the right opportunity. The other one is the ritu, or the seasonal time. Right? And that's the notion of time as you look at it, right? So, the challenge that I'm trying to muse about is the fact that yes, it is exhausting to translate these various things across probably different horizons, because there isn't a particular set of metric normally or easily to account for those prevented futures, the prevented issues, the money that I possibly saved, right? And that's the challenge that we have. So how do we communicate that? And remember, we also talked about the language, we also talked about the permission, we talked about all these things which are all connected, if you will, as we talk about. And this connects to something more foundational now. What happens when the work itself stops producing things that can't hold in your hand? What do I mean by that? The artifact mourning, which I'm sure all of us can easily relate to, which we all of us also subscribe to. We have test cases and we counted them, we put them, we had a template, we filed them, we archived them, we wrote a bug report, we had dashboards. They were all evidence of our existence. The proof that you were here, you did something, you mattered. Measurables. Whereas in the newer work that we do, and what is expected, probably we are having interesting conversations. We are shifting perspectives. We are helping make decisions. It leaves decisions that are not made and that's the grief. Where you're doing your best work that has more impact than you ever had, but you have nothing to show. So if I look at it from now, the artifact, I don't have any proof. I am not producing 100 pages. I'm not writing 10,000 lines of code. And so on and so forth. And that's the idea of the artifact mourning, right? So, Karl Marx, whom we know was a interesting person from Russia, he talked about the idea of the alienation of product. And he wrote that a product is a work of labor, and the workers feel disconnected from what they make, because somebody else owns it, somebody else profits from it, somebody else controls from it. So Karl Marx was a lot of stuff he did about labor. Now we are kind of in a similar sense, we are experiencing a slightly different kind of alienation. Alienation not from what you make, but from the very possibility of making something that persists, right? And that's the whole idea of, the notion of quiet grief. You do showcase your best work, but you have nothing to show. I put in the labor, but I have nothing to show. I'm alienated from that labor. Now, if you go back and look at it from the Eastern side, it's much more deeper, where it talks about the fact, from Heart Sutra, the form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. Now, what the heck do you mean by that? What is physical is not there, which today in the context of physics, I think I stumbled upon an interesting post today, which we all probably have read it in different forms. There is no matter. So we consider ourselves as matter, as physical beings, as something solid. But there isn't anything. It actually is empty. It's just a bunch of vibrations and probability and energy. That's what quantum physics said. And by the way, this was written and this one extracted and posted from a 1958 book by Werner Heisenberg, whom I'm sure you must have read as the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Right? So we are talking about the fact that just because it is intangible doesn't underestimate any value, right? Your conversations, your questions, your influence, these are as real as those ones that we had, your test cases. They are differently embodied. But living that truth really in a very metric-driven world, that's a bit of a problem, because then it gets very spiritual, right? That's the discipline that we need to get into. And that's the challenge that we are running into as artifact mourning, right? The certainty that comes from being able to point and say, I made that, is not there anymore. It's a different kind of a certainty. Harder to hold, but maybe more mature. So have I pushed a lot of weight in the last few minutes? Must have, I think, right? And this connects to something else. Why does doing your best work feel that you're doing your least legitimate work? And that comes to the notion of imposter inversion. What do you mean by that? You feel very fraudulent when you're really best at. What do you mean by that? The old work felt very legitimate, right? It was concrete. I wrote a test case, I executed it, I found a bug, I can point to it, I automated something, it runs the night. And then now we have got judgment, synthesis, influence, asking the right question, pushing. It's seemingly like I'm just talking, man. I don't know if I'm doing. Right? Even though that's where we are. It's seemingly in the talk, it's seemingly in the thinking, and seemingly in the influencing. Right? It feels I'm an imposter. What is the imposter? Am I really doing anything? Anyone could have just said that. Maybe I'm just participating in conversations. Maybe I'm just influencing somebody. I'm starting to doubt myself of how I evolved. This is imposter inversion. Right? Because it's no more just about a pure physical artifact, a pure physical thing. And that's where we're evolving into. And that's what we want everybody to evolve into. And of course we know, with technology, it is becoming more and more necessary in some sense. So how does that relate to philosophy? There is this idea called the beginner's mind, Shoshin. Right? And what does Shoshin say? It's a Zen concept. Right? In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So the Zen, if you have read any book on Zen or Tao, you'll find it's amazingly interesting. Deep sentences put on as interesting contradictions, much like what our philosophy is also. Zen suggests that true expertise feels like not knowing. The master approaches every moment fresh, without fixed ideas about how things should be. Right? So, we are also experiencing something more deeper than this. The more sophisticated your judgment becomes, the more you recognize its contingency. You see what works in this context doesn't work in the other context. We all know that. That's what we've been slowly learning. And that's the right answer. Right? And some time ago we also saw the notion of not this, not that, neti, neti, which is a fundamental bedrock of one of the Upanishads. Right? So, we're incredibly skilled at ruling things out, at seeing what won't work. But that can feel like not having answers. What actually is having a sophisticated perception. And that's what we talked about as imposter infection, inversion. That you have evolved beyond the frameworks that made you feel competent. You are not less skilled. You're operating in a very high domain. Right? I know I probably bumped my time, but just a couple of minutes. And the last one is the drift of the peers. What do I mean by a peer drift? Each of us are evolving at different speeds. We are all at different states, and therefore we are sometimes lonely. And that's what the peer drift is all about. You look around your team, your department, your professional colleagues, your community, and then you know that each of them are transiting at different speeds. Some of them are experiencing exactly what you're experiencing. Some have outgrown that. Some are yet to get there, and so on. And therefore, but we, all of us, when we meet in a team or a community or a conference or whatever, we are sharing the same space. And each of us live in a different reality, in a different professional reality. And that's a peer drift. And that's a kind of a loneliness that we sometimes feel, right? And that's really what is the idea of different, the notion of a community or sangha and the notion of compassion. That means, what does it mean? When we are in this community, so to speak, where each of us are in different paths, and each of us are walking a different path, right? It is important to be compassionate to others. That's the whole idea of the notion of understanding in a community there are different states of people, and some of us would have evolved, some of us are yet to evolve, some of us suffering the process of evolution, and maybe we need to be compassionate about it rather than push through certain ideas or have something strong notion, right? And therefore Buddhism in this case recognizes that each person has a unique path, their unique timing, their unique way of awakening and different speeds. And that's what this is, the idea of the two phrases that I put down as Sangha, which is the community, Karuna, which is the compassion, so to speak. So can you honor where others are without needing them to be where you are? You don't have to be that, right? They are at a different space, different stuff. So, and this peer drift is fundamentally lonely, right? There is no way around. It's also an invitation to stay connected, to recognize that transformation isn't a linear, isn't it uniform, isn't something that everybody does along the same timeline. And the community doesn't have to be moving together to be in a community. You can honor your own evolution and honoring the others on the ground. And so, we've actually walked through the 9 dimensions of this identity drift, from the language gap to the peer drift, all the way from not being able to name your work to watching other experience this. But what ties all of these together? And with that we kind of come to the last minute. Go back where we started off. And professional identity does not disappear. It reorganizes. It is a slow drift. What feels like a drift is alignment still forming. What feels like uncertainty is judgment maturing. We become before we can name what we are becoming. And in that unnamed space, the experience deepens. The contribution broadens. The identity grows more spacious without losing its roots. So thank you for staying with me for an extra 10 minutes. I hope it was interesting, possibly a very deeper one. I absolutely enjoyed trying to make this piece, and thank you so much.